I should have seen this coming. I absolutely should have. Raspberry Pi, the family of ARM-based single-board computers, one of the most successful computers ever built. Earlier this year I did a video exploring all the interesting ways Raspberry Pi gaming is evolving beyond emulators. That encouraged a company to send me a sample of their deeply Gameboy-inspired Raspberry Pi handheld, a device very obviously intended for emulation, but that I used to ramble about the meaning of nostalgia and play a couple of Steam games thanks to some of these technical advances. Now, clearly that was not the end of it, because I received yet another achievement of Raspberry Pi related stuff on my inbox, and the background progress of what can be achieved on a Raspberry Pi has continued to advance at neck-breaking speeds. So let's take an opportunity to explore a couple of ideas through this unexpected pile of devices. Let's start here. Why Raspberry Pi? From those outside the know, a Raspberry Pi is essentially an entire computer in one board using a very cheap ARM CPU, like the one inside your phone, and not an x86 CPU like the one inside your PC or your laptop. Thanks to the explosion of the mobile industry, ARM CPUs are plentiful, so it is not a surprise that many interesting competitors exist. Every time I make a Raspberry Pi video, I am inundated with messages or comments of people asking, why not this other board that is so much better? Part of it comes from popularity. The Raspberry Pi brand is super strong, and that point is reinforced by just how often these competitors either use roots on their name or straight up have Pi there. And a shape that is so familiar that one can very easily accidentally assume this is an official alternative Raspberry Pi model. Last year, when the world made a bit more sense and traveling was a thing I could do, I visited the Raspberry Pi store and the Raspberry Pi offices in Cambridge, and I did have an opportunity to ask Eben Upton, the co-founder and CEO of Raspberry Pi company, about his opinion on the prevalence of those remarkably similar devices, and he also thought it was actually beneficiary to a Raspberry Pi brand.
Yeah, I don't mind, I guess. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? It's a bit sad, right? You know, you would hope that people would feel that doesn't feel like you have a lot of self-respect if you're a company that feels that it has to do that. You know, I always feel every time somebody does that, they advertise my product. Because you're basically saying, when you say that, you're saying our product can't stand on its own. You're saying it can only stand by pretending to be one of these. And that's sad, right? You do see people who release single board computers that have their own names, nice. and I always think, yeah, well done, you know, good on you. You know, you're trying to, you know, carve out your own place in the world, not kind of shoulder into our place. But you know, it doesn't bother me.
What I also have opinions on sticking so close to a brand. What is more interesting to this video is how those other single board computers differentiate. What you're seeing right now is the ROG Pi4, one of the latest from a series of single-board computers using ROG chip SoCs, the same processors found in many white-label budget Android phones, tablets, and TV boxes. This partnership allows them to offer some fantastically aggressive pricing. My feelings is that these are oriented towards industrial or small automation fields rather than maker hobbyist, but I'm not sure why the board was made to look so much like a Raspberry Pi 4. My best guess is that it's meant to have some compatibility with certain Raspberry Pi 4 kits and devices, although the location of the CPU might interfere with a lot of project kits. Either way, a lot of Pi competitors usually define themselves for being cheaper, more powerful, or doing something the Raspberry Pi cannot do. As it is using the fancy big little architecture so many phones are chipping which has slower cores for background tasks and bigger cores for high-performance tasks. In the world of gaming, this just means that the two good cores of the ROG Pi are not much competition to the Raspberry Pi 4. I manually compiled Doom 3 on Debian, and while it was possible to run it, it was not exactly playable, especially compared to the Raspberry Pi. And now it is worth noting this little big architecture is likely going to be better used with something like Android, which the ROG Pi does support officially, while efforts to get Android to Raspberry Pi are still limited. I did want to comment on one thing that I think settles this for me. I was having difficult finding more examples of games I could get working here for comparisons, and that comes down more to my lack of Linux knowledge and just the huge size of the Raspberry Pi community and industry. It is tempting to put both of these things side to side and pick a winner and a loser, but chances are the target consumer is just different. If you're more Linux savvy, it is likely that for some uses, the Raspberry Pis are going to feel limited. While for noobs like me, I might prefer the Raspberry Pi because, among other things, I have a larger community to search help from and a higher number of lower difficulty projects to get started. Maybe I'm off the mark on this. If you're a Linux person, let me know. And on that exact note, the market for beginner-friendly accessories and kits for the Raspberry Pi is plentiful. And here is the RETROFLAG GPi case. This device is the original Raspberry Pi Gameboy kit. I believe the Pi-Boy from the older video was competing against, which triggers a more interesting question. When you compare the bare-bone kit for both devices, we have, considering the price of a Raspberry Pi, the RETROFLAG GPi is the cheaper option if you want a Raspberry Pi handheld. So, what is that? What changes? Both devices stick pretty close to the original aesthetic inspiration. Similar plastic all around, very similar labeling of all ports that emulate the original. Both have integrated speakers. Very similar button type selection, although the RETROFLAG GPi has maybe a bit of a shifting problem that makes the D-pad not perfectly aligned sometimes, but I'm nitpicking. You undoubtedly notice that the GPi case is smaller and does not stick as close to being the exact shape of the original as the Pi-Boy did, but it does stick closer to the original in one unexpected way. It is powered by AA batteries. I very much think this is a cost-saving measure, as the rechargeable battery of the Pi-Boy is bound to inflate the price, but eating through AA batteries each day while gaming is not a memory from my childhood that I would like to revisit. Now, the reason they can get away with it is because of the most important difference of them all. While the Pi-Boy was clearly targeted as a Raspberry Pi 4 handheld, the GPi case works exclusively with the Raspberry Pi Zero. The Raspberry Pi Zero is, as an enthusiast of low-end hardware, one of my favorite little computers. An entire single-core device in a tiny package that costs as much as overpriced first world coffee or an okay-priced medium pizza. I did a video last year where I also talked to Eben Upton about the compromises and decisions that go into building such an absurd product, which I will link in the description. But one unexpected disadvantage of it is that the price is so low that vendors see no margin by selling it. So the only way to find one of them is on kits that include a bunch of stuff that you might or might not need. At least that's how I found mine. Also, you have to consider the power difference. As miraculous as the Zero is, it is still a single-core ultra-low power machine. That means that it will do fine for 2D emulation like Game Boy or Game Boy Advance games, but there's no chance of running something like Dreamcast emulation or any PC game through Box86, which explains the lack of analog controls when compared to the Pi-Boy as well. While this seems like mostly a loss for the GPi case, it kinda makes it up with what might be my favorite loading mechanism ever. The Pi-Boy has a Raspberry Pi 4 inside of it, with port access on the upper part of the device. And the GPi case has a game cartridge. Inside this fake cartridge is where you put the Pi Zero, which, an important point, needs the version without the GPIO pins in order to make the contact with the board, which sounds like the sort of thing that should barely work, but so far it seems to be working fine. Then, if everything is just perfectly connected, you can plug it into the Game Boy using this delightful cartridge port. I kinda wish RETROFLAG could sell these cartridges individually, because you could potentially buy a bunch of Pi Series in bulk from like AliExpress, customize the label, have one game per cartridge and swap them like the old days. It will be the most wasteful first world way of doing this thing, and even though you will be swapping the entire computer rather than just the game, it will still be cheaper than original Game Boy games. Man, technology, it's amazing. This cut in power is also what justifies the GPi case being basically half the resolution, because you are unlikely to play anything on a higher resolution anyway. But that can make it a little bit difficult to navigate the stock RetroPie menus. Thankfully, a tremendous advantage for the GPi case is that it has a surprisingly dedicated community, and you can find a number of custom RetroPie images, like Super RetroPie, that are already pre-configured with menus that are easy to read in this resolution, and all the scripts to get the video output to the screen, controllers and such. Good stuff. although it does not have a battery or Wi-Fi indicator like the default script for the Pi-Boy. All that is left is to load games, which can be a bit of a pain, while the Pi-Boy DMG has direct access to the USB ports, which makes both loading games and plugging a keyboard to configure things like Wi-Fi connection much better. The GPi case has none, so you have to juggle a bit with configuration files and SSH to get everything running. Alright, compared to the Pi-Boy, you're losing the convenience of USB ports, a rechargeable battery, HDMI output, and the ability to emulate 3D games or anything Box86 related. But you're gaining a significantly all-around cheaper case that still sticks pretty close to the original inspiration, that has a community of pretty cool pre-made RetroPie images, and is loaded using a delightful cartridge slot. Not to mention that for some reason the screen on the cheaper GPi case has much more vibrant colors for Gameboy games compared to the Pi-Boy DMG. It is, again, tempting to put these two products on a scale and try to decide which one's better and which one is worse, but in reality I think the two machines can coexist, given how they seem to target different price levels and Pi devices. It all depends on what you prioritize the most. I just find it interesting that so much effort has been spent on so many sides to emulate the look and feel of portable nostalgia. I'm just a tiny bit upset that I could not use this device to show you any of the interesting progress done on Raspberry Pi gaming. And in that exact note, let's talk about the Nintendo Entertainment System. This is a bit weird for me, but I do have a bit of genuine nostalgia for something like the Game Boy. The NES was a console before my time. The first console I ever remember playing was a Super Nintendo, and the first console I owned was a Nintendo 64, so all nostalgia I have for the NES is inherited from decades of iconization in gamer and geek culture. In that regard, there are very few pieces of hardware as emblematic as the Nintendo Entertainment System. This is exemplified by the Nes Classic Edition, a mini console box sold by Nintendo themselves, which basically functions as an emulator for a selection of NES titles. This kickstarted a craze for miniature retro boxes that took the industry by storm a number of years ago. Now, back then, a lot of professional internet commenters were quick to laud a Nintendo's cash grab when you could get a Raspberry Pi emulator box. Now, I have to acknowledge the weirdness of responding to an official re-release of a lot of legacy games by the original owner of the IP with just get a device to emulate copyrighted content that I downloaded from somewhere. I should not have to call legal to explain the legal issues with ROMs, but it is true that there are some elements from Nintendo's offering that leave a lot to be desired. And this is where this comes in. This is the Nes Pi4 Case, also from RetroFlag. This is a Raspberry Pi 4 case that is also inspired by the original NES, but also I feel exists as a response to the NES Classic. I have to give a lot of praise to the design, just as I did on the Pi-Boy, because the extent on which they have tried to emulate the original box actually makes the Nintendo NES Mini look low effort. Notable added details include air vents to the side that are exactly in the same place they will be on the original, and on the under part of the console, which you will not expect anyone to ever check. The official NES Mini just gives you bare plastic, while the NESPi reproduces the weird groups of the original NES down to the unused area for the expansion port, which they label as an SD card storage area. Cool! Perhaps the coolest part of the whole deal is the cartridge slot. The original NES uses a shockingly complex system to load cartridges, which is meant to emulate a VHS tape, which was something the American public was more familiar back in the 80s. This was all part of their desire to appear less like a video game console to avoid the effects of the then very recent collapse of the American gaming market. The official NES Mini has none of that. This is a decoration to make it feel like a slot, but that is just a groove, there's nothing there. But on the NESPi, what's this? Is this a cartridge on a Raspberry Pi 4 case? When I originally saw this, I assumed it was a prop for added realism or something, so imagine my surprise when I discovered this can house a small SSD. The SSD isn't included, this is a shell that you can open and add one. It is also a super tight fit. My cheap Chinese questionable hard drive will not fit completely, but this cheap known brand 128GB disc did. Honestly, I might never take it out, this is such a cool shell for an SSD. Inside this are connectors to the SATA port that connect to the Pi 4 using USB, meaning that you can then use a SATA adapter to load games and other files into the cartridge and then insert it into the console to give the Raspberry Pi access to it. This is a bit unpractical because you need a SATA adapter to connect to your PC, but damn, is this a cool idea to incorporate a cartridge into the design. Extra points to RETROFLAG, I really like it. Inside the device, which you're gonna have to put it together yourself, you will find a bit of custom hardware to manage the USB ports, as well as the power and reset buttons in front. The SSD is connected to the Pi through yet another USB adapter connected to the upper lid, which is a great use for the Pi4's USB 3 interface. As you notice, this is actively cooled through this fan and a heatsink connected to the SoC and memory through thermal pads. I was worried that this case's priority to stick so close to the original design will cause a heating issue by not providing enough airflow, but in stock clocks it did fine. In fact, it did fine with some overclocking too, although I ran into an issue I did not expect: lack of power. The Raspberry Pi 4 can, at best, pull 5 volts and 3 amps, and when you start using more power that it can draw, you start getting this warning. I'm sure having a SATA to USB SSD is not helping, but even with that unplugged, I was getting a lot of these warnings with even very modest overclocks. In fact, I got a lot of warnings for low power with the SSD installed in stock clocks too, so this probably wasn't designed for the level of games I plan to test this. Either that or there's a problem with the OS I used. Keep in mind then, as I start running games, that most of what you will see is using stock clocks. Sadly, this did not include a NES-style controller, although that is not hard to find. But if you want to run more games, you're gonna need a better interface. You might have noticed that there was a controller among the things I was sent, which was included because I was assured it was a Raspberry Pi compatible, but it was a bit more than that, so I think it's worth mentioning. This is the GuliKit Alps Plus controller, an Android, iPhone, Windows and Switch controller that also perfectly pairs with the Raspberry Pi. It is portable, it is comfortable, it has a gyroscope for Switch games, it's my new travel controller, and it is what I will use for any controller-enabled games I tested on this video. And it's great, I don't have a lot to say about it, it's just a good controller. And that finally gets me to the games. Now, as you might know, I am fascinated by the recent changes made to the world of Raspberry Pi gaming, and the progress is happening so fast that it has been challenging to write this script, as by the time I'm finally done with this video, this information will likely already be slightly outdated. What you're seeing right now is something that I failed to mention on my latest video, which is that you are able to run the original Half-Life natively on a Raspberry Pi, and therefore on this NESPi. The gold source engine Half-Life runs on is not open source, but similarly to the Celeste example I used on an older video, there's an open source re-implementation of the engine called X-3D SDL. I'm probably mispronouncing that. This re-implementation from scratch of the engine can run files from the original Half-Life installation, and since it is open source, it can be compiled and run on a Raspberry Pi without much trouble. For most of my tests, I use a pre-made image called Twister OS. Configuration for some of the stuff I'm going to show you can be trickier than expected for a Linux noob like myself, so pre-configured images like this can be a godsend. As I mentioned so many times recently, there's this absolutely fantastical project called Box86 that aims to build a high-performance emulator layer to run 32-bit x86 Linux games on an ARM computer like the Raspberry Pi. On previous videos I have shown you this working on Steam and already running some 2D indie games with hopes of demoing it running 3D games soon. And well, that was fast. Several things to note here. While progress on Box86 continues to evolve very rapidly, since the last video I have been warned to stay away from Steam since their 32-bit support is a bit wacky and the best results are achieved through DRM-free games like the ones you get from GOG. While performance is not perfect, especially given the limitation of the current project, I was surprised by the progress on a large variety of Linux PC games. I would really like to see a project kit like this NES but center around this type of game. Here's one last interesting demo. This is Wine Desktop. Wine is a compatibility layer that runs x86 Windows programs on x86 Linux. So that means that what you're seeing here is going to be a Windows application running through Wine to Box86 that in turn translates that into ARM that the Raspberry Pi can execute. Given the sheer amounts of layers of abstraction, it is a miracle anything works here, and this is very early stages. And yet, there are already games working here. How? When I was writing this video, progress was made on even including loot trees on it, and there are crazy people making progress on getting Windows for ARM running on a Raspberry Pi. This video is too long already, and I'm clearly going to have to end up making another one. Look, for the moment the Raspberry Pi ecosystem continues to surprise. On the hardware level, there are cheaper options for making handhelds that take some compromises but are kinda nice for retro handheld gaming, and kits that have so many cool details that they make official Nintendo products feel cheap by comparison, even if they were not designed for the particular use case I ended up with. I still think we are at the gates of a revolution in Raspberry Pi gaming thanks to software like Wine and Box86. I have been told that this process is currently limited by just being able to use OpenGL on the Pi, but the Raspberry Pi company is working on a Vulkan driver, so that big twist might be coming sooner than expected. And with that, we're done. I have made this video tons enough with topics already, so I'm pushing the limits of what YouTube might tolerate, which is why my extended thoughts are now in Nebula. Hear me out for a second. Nebula is a streaming service that me and a bunch of other creators are building up as the perfect companion pack for YouTube. You got extended cuts of videos with no ads, you get original content that we can make without worrying about the algorithm, you get original podcasts like my show Genesis where I interview creators about their YouTube origin stories. You can find a free feed for the podcast right now in the description with my good friend Fiersu.
It's such a vivid memory, and I feel bad for people who didn't get scammed as kids in RuneScape. Like you said, it's just such a big memory, such a important thing to learn.
But new episodes always premiere in Nebula, where you can now find a very fascinating episode with none other than Super Bunny Hop. Did any of your passion for gaming affected your high school years in other ways? Were you...
Oh yeah, they were terrible.
Please tell me more.
No!
And the good news is that you can get on the phone for free right now. We partnered up with CuriosityStream, the internet's best source for documentaries and non-fictional content, for a special offer. If you sign up for CuriosityStream with the link in the description, you get access to Nebula for free, and you can get a 26% on the annual subscription. So that's less than $15 for a year, and you get access to both CuriosityStream and Nebula, so you can listen to my podcast and soon watch my original, which I just finished the script on and will start more heavy production very soon. There is no one else doing as much for high quality content as they are right now, so show this some love and support my channel and so many others. Thank you to them for sponsoring this video and you for watching.